Well, to discuss Qantas and also today's interest rate cut, I was joined a short time ago from Canberra by the Shadow Treasurer, Joe Hockey. Joe Hockey, I'll come to Qantas-related issues in a moment, but firstly on today's RBA cut. You asked in question time today if the Prime Minister would guarantee that the banks would pass on the cut in full. Is increased government regulation of banks now coalition policy?
No, it isn't, Lee, but you can use various levers, as I've talked about in the past, to encourage the banks to deliver the cuts through in full. For example, at the suggestion of the coalition, the government introduced legislation for covered bonds, which makes funding cheaper for the banks, and you do a good favour for the banks should do a good favour for their customers.
But I could all but guarantee that if the Prime Minister started interfering in any sort of private bank business, that you would be screaming blue murder.
Well, that's right, and that's why you asked the Prime Minister whether she can do that, because Wayne Swan has been backgrounding the media for the last 24 hours that he has been ringing around the banks, putting pressure on them to deliver a full rate cut if the RBA moved today. So he's raised the stakes. I responded.
So how come when interest rates go down, the government never gets credit, but when they go up, it's always the government's fault?
Well, in this situation, interest rates have come down, as the Reserve Bank said in its statement, because of a fall in consumer confidence and because economic growth is not as strong as was expected. Now, the government claimed, and the Treasurer lied to the Australian people in question time when he said that it's their fiscal policy that the Reserve Bank took into account, whereas in the 6-paragraph statement from the Reserve Bank, they did not once refer to the government's fiscal policy as a reason for them
But that
to
doesn't
reduce
mean they
interest
didn't
rates.
take it into account. I mean, the Reserve Bank of Australia would always be taking their current fiscal policy settings into account.
Yes, but in their statement, and that's why they have a statement, they actually said there were international factors. They also identified a fall in consumer confidence, a fall in growth outside of the resources sector as the reasons why they were reducing rates.
Your question today implies that the Coalition wants government interference in banking. You want government intervention in the Qantas dispute. Your policy on climate change is direct government action rather than a market mechanism. There seems to be mounting evidence that the Coalition is abandoning its long-held belief in the free market.
Not at all.
So how do you explain that you want so much government intervention in all of those different areas?
Well, it's not direct government action that may be necessary from time to time, but it can be government simply picking up the phone and doing something, speaking to people, asking them what they need, how they can resolve issues. That's what a proactive government does without the heavy hand of more regulation. And that's what we have done in the past. That's what we'll do again.
On the Qantas issue, though, you weren't just saying that that's what you wanted. You wanted the government to take some action under the Fair Work Act. That is direct government intervention.
Well, it is the government's act. They were the ones that introduced Section 431, which gave the government power to ensure the matter went to arbitration immediately.
But it just amazes me that the Coalition is calling for the government to intervene in the activity of a private company like Qantas.
No, it shouldn't be the case.
Well,
because, for example, Lee, when I was Minister for Industrial Relations, John Howard asked me to directly deal with the parties in TriStar to have a matter resolved, which I did. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use the regulation. The issue is that this government has been warned by Qantas on numerous occasions that if the industrial relations environment deteriorated, then Qantas would ground the fleet. Now, they've been warned on numerous occasions. The government didn't respond. Anthony Albanese is using cute language talking about a lockout at 8 p.m. on Monday. So he's more interested in the lockout of staff, of union officials and staff on the Monday than he was in dealing with the Saturday crisis of the grounding of the Qantas fleet.
But they dealt with the Saturday crisis and the Qantas fleet's back in the air.
But 48 hours of chaos for Australian consumers and significant damage to our international reputation, as I cited in Parliament.
And that's the government's fault, not Qantas's fault or the union's fault?
Well, obviously, if the government had been warned about a possible grounding of the fleet, which they had been, and Anthony Albanese has conceded that they were warned about a possible grounding of the fleet, the government didn't act previously, and they should have. They should have been more decisive. But now they're just playing these games.
You don't think it sends a chill through the business community to hear a coalition spokesman say, well, the government should have stepped in and taken a heavy hand in an industrial dispute?
No.
Well, your own former Industrial Relations Minister, Peter Reith, says that the practice of government stepping into those sort of disputes has been out-of-date thinking for 20 years.
Well, he was talking about a regulatory involvement. We have to deal with the laws that exist at the moment. The Fair Work Act exists and it has direct provisions that deal with this. But in the past, of course ministers have been involved. I was Minister for Industrial Relations. I was involved in trying to settle a matter that was causing unrest in a particular business or particular workers.
What do you say to the argument that because the Coalition has no industrial relations policy, your arguments against the government's actions in the Qantas dispute are entirely based on political calculations, that your actions aren't driven by any strongly held IR policy principles because you don't currently have any?
Well, it's just dead wrong.
Well, but you don't have an IR policy.
Well, we do. We're not changing the Fair Work Act. That's our current policy. We'll have a detailed policy before the next election.
When did you first hear from Qantas that it was considering the option of grounding its fleet or locking out staff, that it was considering that option?
Well, it's been saying it around Parliament House for the last few weeks.
But I'm asking when you specifically
Everyone in Parliament House knew. Well, I specifically heard they were going to undertake a lockout and a grounding at 4:45 on Saturday.
But I'm asking when you first heard that they were
hours.
considering that option, that was the sort of stuff that was
weeks
on the
ago.
table.
They've been saying that weeks ago, publicly and privately.
In a meeting?
They have been saying for weeks.
And did you hear this in a meeting with Qantas representatives?
Look, Lee, they have been saying it privately and publicly around Parliament House for weeks.
But I'd just like to know specifically when you actually heard that. Like, I don't want you to say generally. But you would have heard it personally in a meeting from a Qantas representative at some time in the past few weeks?
Yeah, sure, as did others. Yeah, the Qantas have been in this building for weeks.
Joe Hockey, thank you very much.
Thanks, Lee.